Welcome back to the ShelterWF podcast. This is episode 2, and I'm Keegan. I'm the executive director of ShelterWF, and I'm here with my good friend, Mallory Phillips. Tell me about how you know ShelterWF.
All right. Well, Mallory Phillips. I am one of the co-founders of ShelterWF. My partner, Nathan, and I, a friend, Ellie McMahon, and then Keegan founded the board in 2022 in April after the denial of Mountain Gateway. And that was kind of what got me into housing. And so here we are.
What's your day job?
I am a therapist, was a therapist at Kalispell Middle School, and now I have transitioned to starting to work out in Whitefish.
So we're kind of starting this podcast, bringing on all the people that have been involved with ShelterWF since the beginning and talking about books. And so I approached you and I was like, what book do you want to discuss? And your answer was pretty immediate, which was The Color of Law. Why is that?
The Color of Law is kind of like I was getting into housing stuff even before Mountain Gateway, and through my learning about housing, I kept getting recommended The Color of Law. And as like a lefty progressive, I kind of grew up in Whitefish as sort of NIMBY. Like it wasn't uncommon for those around me to be pretty anti like new housing. And so actually reading The Color of Law, it unlocked something for me and helped me understand the history of policy. And actually the denial of Mountain Gateway and reading The Color of Law led me to actually apply for grad school to get my master's in social work. A lot of my projects throughout school focused on exclusionary zoning, and I did a paper on the National Housing Act of 1934, and it gets touched upon in The Color of Law. So to me, The Color of Law is one of those really important parts of my origin into the pro-housing movement.
Yeah, I think it's really cool how the pro-housing movement, I feel like everyone I talked to got into it from a different angle. It's unique in that way where both across the ideological spectrum and across your interests, in some ways because there is no degree in the type of policy movement that the pro-housing movement is. And so because of that, you get an incredibly diverse amount of perspectives. And I think The Color of Law is one of the best examples of that.
Well, and what's funny is, so Color of Law kind of inspired me in part to go back to school. And then the summer before grad school started, we were required to read another book called The Sum of Us. And it was really interesting because The Sum of Us talks about kind of when policies are crafted to harm one group, that it often harms the society as a whole, and that ties straight into like what they talk about in The Color of Law. So it was just interesting. As soon as I started grad school, I went to school to be a therapist, but then I ended up spending the 2 years focusing on housing. So it was really interesting how that all played out.
So this book came out in 2017. It's The Color of Law, Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America by Richard Rothstein. And I really, really enjoyed reading it. Well, I don't know. The experience of reading it is remarkably depressing.
Yes.
The amount of examples, particularly among pioneers, right? Mm-hmm. The story of like Black pioneers in the 20th century is often now reduced down to one of success, right? The amount of stories in this book of a Black family or a white family wants to integrate a neighborhood, and they are given resistance for years, for decades. They are threatened, they are like firebombed, and then they have to give up on the project. The amount of failure in this book is all the way through to the 1980s is ridiculous, and it made the experience of reading this extremely sad, which is necessary because of the thesis of the book. So to get into the thesis, Richard Rothstein is a lawyer, and at the start of the book sets it up in a legal framework, which is there is a common jurisprudence right now that basically says we cannot reverse segregation in any significant way because the segregation that happened was de facto. It wasn't official government policy. It was just racial attitudes and biases, and that's not something that the government has any responsibility to correct. What he says, like, very affirmatively is that that is false, and that the majority of that discrimination was de jure. And de jure is this legal term of art that means it was directly perpetrated by government agencies. And the framing of basically every part of the book is this is how this was a top-down process of segregation that touched many different aspects of society, but all come back to housing. And because of that, you don't need like structural or societal racism to explain that. And what he's saying is the most narrowly defined harm you can find is de facto by the government. Racial segregation in housing was not merely a project of Southerners in the former slaveholding Confederacy. It was a nationwide project of the federal government in the 20th century, designed and implemented by its most liberal leaders. Our system of official segregation was not the result of a single law that consigned African Americans to designated neighborhoods. Rather, scores of racially explicit laws, regulations, and government practices combined to create a nationwide system of urban ghettos surrounded by white suburbs. Private discrimination also played a role, but it would have been considerably less effective if it had not been embraced and reinforced by government.
Yeah, there is another book, and it's essentially the next book he writes with his daughter. And they kind of have a book that focuses on like how to put into action.
So that book is called Just Action.
Oh, there it is.
It's basically an entire book on the fixes. And maybe that's one we'll discuss next.
Yeah, that would be good.
The book is organized in basically laying out all these different ways in which the government sponsored segregation and enforced it. And so it goes through a bunch of different distinct mechanisms. Probably the biggest one, and the one that had the most wide-reaching implications, is that the Federal Housing Administration would not insure mortgages until there were racial covenants to say this property can only be sold to Caucasians. It can't be rented to anyone that's not Caucasian. And that influences so much of the system because housing is financed through banks and through loans, and the banks will not issue it if they cannot get support from the Federal Housing Administration in insuring those loans. And because of that, there's no way to build integrated communities for most of the 20th century. And then there's all sorts of other government interventions. Government-sanctioned violence against black families in white neighborhoods, government promotion of single-family homes as white flight happens, government building highways through black neighborhoods on purpose in the mid-20th century as you have the federal highway system starting, and then public housing as well. But the main way is zoning.
Do you talk about Levittown anywhere?
It's kind of all the way throughout.
Okay.
Obviously, it's like one of the first
Yeah.
suburbs.
Yeah. They shared a story of a black family who was middle class and built this business, and it helped build a bunch of the housing projects. For those listening, Levittown was this big suburban development that happened after World War II, but they only opened it up to white families. These black middle-class families who were a part of the construction of places like this, they had the economic ability to purchase, and yet they were cut out.
Yeah, Levittown is supported by the government. The people that are buying it are veterans and are getting subsidized mortgages from the GI Bill. That is the prototypical white picket fence, single-family car-dependent suburb. That is the template repeated all across the nation, and it is whites only. The other interesting thing about Levittown is it's seen as super affordable at the time, and those homes are like 800 square feet. Yeah. Yeah. Even Levittown is like the type of zoning that isn't allowed in most American cities today, which I think is really funny. The price of Levittown homes, given all the government subsidies and just the price of housing at the time, would be about $80,000 today. And those homes are selling for $400K today. So if you think about the wealth gap in America, the fact that from the start, the appreciation of housing that we talked about in episode 1, which is basically we've built our economy around housing prices appreciating super, super fast. And when you combine that with the fact that we laid out the board such that only white people could own the types of houses that appreciate really, really quickly, we have set it up so that even if we don't have discriminatory policies today, segregation perpetuates itself really strongly. And I thought the example of Levittown is a really good example of that.
Yeah, and then there was like another piece where they talked about how there was also this mythology, like once it was illegal or like semi-illegal to cut Black families out, the way that real estate agents would get white families to sell their homes was that this fear that if a Black family moved into a neighborhood that their homes would depreciate, right? And then they would lose value. And in the book, it actually talks about how the value is actually more because Black families were willing to pay more to get into these neighborhoods, which just kind of, going into the zoning, it really just shows how much where you live and what type of housing you have access to can really play a role into how your life goes, but potentially future generation.
So the chapter of this book that I think is the most important for our purposes as ShelterWF is the chapter on zoning. In the early 1900s, like 1910, a bunch of cities start adopting racial zoning where you will have a zone that's R1, and the definition of R1 is white. And R2 is Black. That type of very, very explicit racial zoning is struck down at the Supreme Court in 1917, the decision Buchanan versus Warley. So they explicitly strike down racial zoning. You can't write Black district into law. The immediate and long-lasting response of that is that cities utilize zoning that's not explicitly racial to discriminate and to segregate white and Black populations. That is the origin of zoning. So there's a few quotes in here. To prevent lower-income African Americans from living in neighborhoods where middle-class whites resided, local and federal officers began to promote zoning ordinances to reserve middle-class neighborhoods for single-family homes that lower-income families of all races could not afford. Certainly, an important and perhaps primary motivation of zoning rules that kept apartment buildings out of single-family neighborhoods was a social class elitism that was not itself racially biased. But there was also enough racial intent behind exclusionary zoning that it is integral to the story of segregation. Such economic zoning was rare in the United States before World War I, but the Buchanan decision provoked urgent interest in zoning as a way to circumvent the ruling. My main question throughout this entire book as I'm reading it is, how does this apply to the Flathead Valley into Montana? How does this connect to a place where we're 95% white? How does this connect to a place where the on-the-surface racial segregation that took place in so many different larger cities with more diverse populations didn't take place here in the same way? I don't think people upholding the system of zoning in Montana in the modern day and in Whitefish are doing that because they have an intent of racism. Some of them, I think, absolutely have an intent of classism, and that's like very obvious. Mm-hmm. And I think it's built into that as well. And I don't think it's useful to read this book and then say, we're being racist.
Yeah.
What it absolutely does impact is that we are told this lie that zoning just emerged because we needed good city planning, that zoning is about a coal plant next to the school. And that is a lie. It comes from a racist society's desire to segregate people by class and race explicitly. Mm-hmm. And it is unnecessary to build a city to a good standard in terms of livability. And the reason you know that's true is that we're basically the only country in the world that has Euclidean zoning at all. Zoning is not necessary to have a city work well. The urban planning profession utilizes zoning now to do city planning in a way that creates incomprehensibly stupid cities. Some of the least well-planned cities in the world are right here in the old US of A. And that is because the urban planning profession decided to not do most of the stuff that good urban planning is, because you're going to spend 95% of your time micromanaging what happens on individual lots. And so I will always continue to point out how much of an outlier we are in that respect, and how much that isn't bottom up. It's not directed by the community. The idea that individual people in cities wanted this system. Now we've put so much money into that absolutely people now support zoning because they think it will help them in their neighborhood, right?
But it wasn't inherent. It wasn't
but because we created a system where that was the case.
And not to mention when you go visit some of the cities in this country and even around here, like the neighborhoods that are most desirable are not those white picket fence, suburban sprawl neighborhoods. Like the neighborhoods that are most desirable in some of these big cities are the places that were built before zoning. And he talks about it in the book that there were lots of examples of places that had integrated naturally, right? And some of those neighborhoods are still very highly desired today.
Totally. The model zoning ordinance that still is the foundation of our zoning code comes out of 1928 in the Hoover administration, and their Commerce Department publishes a model zoning code and a zoning primer. And the type of single-family zoning that's invented in Berkeley, California, in a race-exclusive way, goes nationwide. And that goes to states that have no black population, like Montana by that point. But the intent is still racial. It's not about separating incompatible uses, because you can just do that in your municipal code by just writing nuisance laws. And that's what's super common in other countries. The idea of single-use zoning comes directly from doing race surveys. Other influential zoning experts made no effort to conceal their expectation that zoning was an effective means of racial exclusion. Columbia Law School professor Ernst Freund, the nation's leading authority on administrative law in the 1920s, observed that preventing the coming of colored people into a district was actually a more powerful reason for the spread of zoning during the previous decade than the creation of single-family districts, the stated justification for zoning. Because the Buchanan decision had made it impossible to find an appropriate legal formula for segregation, Freud said that zoning masquerading as an economic measure was the most reasonable means of accomplishing the same end. They were just saying it.
Yeah. And so from my perspective, as someone who went to school for social work and I'm a therapist now, like understanding the history of policy when you're crafting policy is extremely important. I think that's part of this conversation too. A lot of folks who engage at policy discussions at a local level have no education of what is the history of the zoning, right? We can't make informed decisions about good policy going forward if we don't understand the history of policy.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. So you're on the Whitefish Planning Commission. I've seen you in City Hall a lot, and you are very, very willing to mention this book to talk about the racist origins of terms like neighborhood character and stuff like that. What do you see as the response to that in a city like Whitefish that is theoretically progressive?
Yeah, I mean, I just think there's like a meme out there, and it's like a big fancy house when it says all people are welcome here, and then right next to it is some sign against new housing. And so even like rewinding back to why we started this organization in the first place is that we wanted to give more people access to education to understand this history. When people are coming to those meetings and those people that are on the planning board, in their minds, they are doing the right thing, right? When you don't know the history, you can think you're doing the right thing when you're totally ignoring those impacts, right? So for me, when the discussion boils down to neighborhood character and we only focus on the look of the building, it's totally ignoring the historical nature of who lived in Whitefish, right? And it's complicated. Like a lot of families, including mine, benefited from racist policies that gave settlers access to a bunch of land and pushed Native Americans off of land. Like that is a part of this, and it's complicated, right? When talking about the railroaders and the timber folks who built this town, they were poor. Like if you look at the old historic homes in Whitefish, they're not nice. They're old railroad homes. If you look in Kalispell, the old homes are like very nice. And so I think that it's really hypocritical when we play this fight over neighborhood character over the building type alone, because it just ignores all these other pieces, you know?
Yeah, I think also there is definitely value in walking down the block and listening to what people say and relying on anecdotes. And also, if you are trying to think clearly about equity or who we're helping and who we're harming when we decide on policy, then that is going to be incredibly limiting if you live in a place that is very, very stratified by income.
Well, and I even think about like some of the things my grandpa said when I was younger. And, you know, there was a ton of apathy by people who were working class in the early 2000s during the last time we had a big boom. Those weren't the voices that were at City Hall making some of these decisions the last big growth time. That is where it's hard when we only are listening to the current residents, because we're kind of ignoring what are the factors that led our downtown neighborhoods to have $1 million homes.
Right? I mean, you mentioned that those people think they're doing the right thing by preserving the very, very exclusionary institutions that we have. And I understand how you can come to that perspective, because for them, for their neighbors, for the particular economic and generational position that they inhabit and that their block inhabits, they are correct. They are doing the right thing for them. What I'm constantly trying to get the world to realize is that you have to be able to look broader than your own particular block to think about what is the best for people at large.
Yeah, and recognizing we are a community. And if we only listen to the voices of current residents, then that's not a community-focused process, right? And I think going back to me being on the planning board, that's what I always try to bring, like understanding how policy gets made at a local, state, and federal level. The people who are crafting policy are often not the people most impacted by the policy. So that's the voice that I try to bring into the room in the planning board, is I am talking to the people who are most impacted by these policies, who are constantly having to move. And I just understand that the people on the planning board, all of them are homeowners. All of them are very far removed from what it actually means to live in the Flathead right now.
The stories around zoning too are also very heartbreaking in this book. So there's this one example that runs throughout the book, which is around the Bay Area and how segregated the Bay Area is, which is funny because that's where the YIMBY movement comes from at the start. But he's talking about Milpitas. Ford is building a new plant in the Bay Area, and union leaders met with Ford executives and negotiated an agreement permitting all 1,400 Richmond plant workers, including the approximately 250 African Americans, to transfer to the new facility. Once Ford's plans became known, Milpitas residents incorporated the town and passed an emergency ordinance permitting the newly installed city council to ban apartment construction and only allow single-family homes. Right? So the racial intent of that is so clear. There's a story later in the book where what zoning did really effectively was keep lower-income black families out of white neighborhoods. What it couldn't do was prevent middle-class black residents from moving into middle-class white neighborhoods. A lot of the second half of the book is describing the private racial covenants, the threat of violence, and the other ways in which residents used city planning apparatuses and of integration.
Well, and then they even talked about policy that was highlighted, essentially no interracial marriage. They were crafting zoning and saying, well, we're preventing interracial marriage, right? So you see, as people are trying to stop segregation, there's all these ways in which government policies were intentionally crafted to really try to continue to oppress African Americans, right?
Totally. This is where you get into the only mentions of Montana in the book.
Which I was like reading it, I was like, what? A whole section on Montana?
So in 1890, every Montana county had at least one black resident. By 1930, 11 counties had been entirely cleared of black residents, and 41 of 56 counties had fewer than 10. So I didn't know about the history of African American residents in Helena. Did you know about this?
No, I didn't know about that either.
So At the turn of the 20th century, African Americans in Helena had an established middle-class community. Helena's African Methodist Episcopal Church was important enough to host their Western Regional Conference. The city had black newspapers, black-owned businesses, and a black literary society that drew 100 attendees to hear presentations by poets, playwrights, and essayists. But in 1906, Helena's prosecuting attorney expressed the new attitude of public authorities when he announced, "It is time that the respectable white people of this community rise in their might and assert their rights." 3 years later, Montana banned marriages between blacks and whites.
Yeah, and it's funny because when I mentioned this book or the concepts of this book at the planning board, I upset someone very substantially in the audience and just made some comment about how we're not racist and this doesn't have any impact right here, right now. But right, like the story in Montana often is like, we're white because white people want to live here. But then you hear the history of
We had a lot of sundown towns as well.
Yes.
In Miles City, a once substantial African-American community was forced to flee by white mob violence. In 1910, 81 African Americans comprised 2% of the Miles City population. Today it has only 25 or 0.3%. Helena, the population peaked at 3.4% of the population in 1910 and was down to a few dozen by 1970. It's funny, these Mountain West places are super racially homogenous, and if you just talk to someone who has no conception of what racial distribution in the United States is like, you would probably think that northern places after slavery and after Reconstruction stops in the 1880s would be some of the most diverse because they had like better racial attitudes, right? That would just be your kind of first principles thought. The fact that these places are so white actually isn't very intuitive unless you consider the factor of government-sponsored segregation that drove black people out. And zoning's a really big part of that.
The racial makeup of the valley now and where people live, and
Totally.
you know,
It's
pretty clear when you look into the racial dynamics or the racial makeup of each community.
Well, it's so funny. It's like, how can race play a part when we're in a completely segregated community? It's like, well, yeah
exactly.
We're in a completely segregated community. That's a result of the racism, right?
That's the point, right?
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point, which is there is a history of racial dynamics in Montana. The most prevalent of those is Native Americans, right? This book didn't touch on it at all. I don't know if you know anything about it.
I don't have any specific data on me right now, but I do know that in Montana, if you're a Native American, you are more likely to become homeless, even off the reservation, right? And so when we do policy at a state level, when we try to change policy to be less exclusionary, we are thinking about how does policy impact those people off reservation?
And in putting together the newsletter, which everyone should sign up to our tremendous ShelterWF newsletter, there was a good series of articles by Montana Free Press called The Shelter Gap that went through the history of why home ownership is so much lower on reservations, why there's such a chronic housing shortage on reservation land, and a lot of the barriers that both residents and developers face in that arena. We'll put the link to those in the show notes because I think those are really good articles that put it in a Montana-specific context as well. There's a ton of racism against Chinese in Montana. We had more than 2,500 Chinese residents in 1890 and over 30 Chinese laundries in Butte alone, which are the exact type of business that single-family zoning in Berkeley initially zoned out. And then Chinese immigrants were legally barred from owning or leasing land. I think that the main point is that the exclusionary tools that built segregation didn't get repealed when the racial motive became taboo, right? They got kept and they got pointed at class. I think they already were, but they got exclusively.
That became the major focus.
In a place as white as Whitefish, you keep out the people that can only afford an apartment or a small lot or a manufactured home. And so it's the same mechanism that the book describes, but the racial layer is kind of sanded off because they were effectively banned 80 years ago. Yeah. And so, yeah, I think the fact that it's the very same euphemisms around property values and compatibility and neighborhood character, you know, there's an entire section of the book saying that you would have situations where one black person moves into a neighborhood and then you had blockbusters, you had these real estate speculators that would send flyers to everyone on the block saying, like, black people are going to move into your neighborhood and destroy it. And they would hire black people to walk up and down the street and call people on the block with names that sounded like African Americans, right? And that's the origin of the term neighborhood character, right? Which is still bandied about and is in our growth policy in Whitefish in 20.
Right. And if we want to be intentional about, people on the city council will say all day long that they're progressive and they're liberal and they're a welcoming community. You just can't have things like neighborhood character in your growth policy if that's truly how you feel, right?
It's not that we're saying these people have racist intent.
Not
it's that the origin of this system is about segregation.
And it does matter.
Initially
right?
racial and now class-based, right? Income-based. And that form of segregation is alive and well. And so I think that kind of brings us into the part of this book that basically describes, okay, so explicit racial segregation is over. But there's just a really long tail on housing effects. You think about the types of segregation that were addressed in the 60s with the Civil Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act. But the difference between segregation of buses or water fountains or schools is that those can be solved much more quickly. It's like you change the law, the next day there's no different sections on the bus, right? Mm-hmm. There are still people alive in homes today that purchased those homes when they were exclusively white. Mm-hmm. So it's very hard to undo that. And compared to 1960, we are more segregated today than we were. If you set up a situation that's inherently unequal, and then you replace that with being completely blind to race, in a situation like housing that is so tied up in wealth, those wealth disparities are only going to increase, right? And so this is where the book takes center aim at current policy, not just historical policy, because you can't just get rid of segregation and imagine that everything's going to go back to normal, right? They say actions of government in housing cannot be neutral about segregation. They will either exacerbate or reverse it. So right now we have an income gap of around $38K for African Americans to an average of $60K for white Americans. The wealth gap is an average of $10K for black Americans and $110K for white Americans, right? So that wealth gap is far wider than the income gap. It's this compounding effect of who got appreciating land in the prior century.
Well, I even think about today, right? Like the housing crisis is everywhere. And, for millennials and Gen Z, if you know someone who owns their own home, there's probably a likelihood that their parents helped out in some way. That often ties into the equity that's building on the homes that these people are owning and how that impacts future generations to even be able to get into the housing market.
If I have connections in the Valley, and that's great, and most people don't. And I don't think that the ability to live for a reasonable price on a reasonable wage should be dependent on that.
Well, and that builds into the exclusionary aspect, right?
Yeah. So this is primarily a book describing the problem. I think the explicit purpose that Richard Rothstein has in this book is to put forward a new legal framework. And the purpose is not to describe a set of policy solutions that might reverse that, though he does get into it a little bit. What he does say is that a remedy would be a ban on zoning ordinances that prohibit multifamily housing or that require all single-family homes in a neighborhood to be built on large lots with high minimum requirements for square footage. These rules prohibit both lower income and middle-class families from settling in affluent suburbs. Exclusionary zoning ordinances were partly motivated by unconstitutional racial animosity. So I think the hopeful read of this book is that segregation, if it was built by policy, it can be unbuilt by policy, right? That's reversible.
Yeah, and I think you see it all, they have zoning and subdivisions that are built that are 55 plus, right? And how because segregation is kind of the basis of zoning, we have created a dynamic that really divides our country in all these different ways, right? 55 plus, we've got places like Whitefish that are just becoming more wealthy And then the impact on society as a whole. I think he talks briefly about how this is impacting division and politics too. I just thought that was an interesting, like, once you start to see the ways in which exclusionary zoning impacts society, you can really, it's like that housing theory of everything. It really just like bleeds into all these other spaces.
Yeah, absolutely. The one other thing I wanted to talk about was public housing. So in the United States, the perception of public housing is like very, very bad. I think this book did a really good job of laying out how the idea of public housing as exclusively for low-income people and super racially dependent develops in the post-war era. Before that, it's much more mixed income, and it is seen as a government service more than as a welfare state item. And it can sustain itself and its maintenance partly through government support and partly through rents.
Yep, and through that mixed income rent, right?
And I think it's really frustrating where it's like we could have had a system more like Vienna or Singapore or some of these other places where public supported housing is much more common and it serves people across incomes, right?
I did a whole section in my paper on the National Housing Act of 1934 on how America was at this point, you know, where they could have gone in a completely different direction because places like Vienna, they decided to do things differently.
Yeah, so there's a quote here. The real estate lobby was successful in restricting public housing to subsidize projects for the poorest families only. New federal and local regulations set forth strict upper income limits for families in public housing. Beginning in about 1950, many middle-class families, white and black, were forced out under these new rules, although many would have preferred to stay in the low-rise, scatter-site, and well-maintained projects that mostly characterized pre-1949 public dwellings. This policy change, mostly complete by the late 1960s, ensured that integrated public housing would cease to be possible. It transformed public housing into a warehousing system for the poor. The condition of public projects rapidly deteriorated, partly because housing authority maintenance workers and their families had to leave the buildings where they worked because their wages made them ineligible to live there, and partly because the loss of middle-class rents resulted in inadequate maintenance budgets. As a result, the condition and then the reputation of public housing collapsed. By 1973, the changeover was mostly complete. President Richard Nixon announced that public housing should not be forced on white communities that didn't want it, and he reported to Congress that many public housing projects were monstrous, depressing places, run down, overcrowded, crime-ridden.
And you can even hear that in some of the comments when you go to city council meetings when there is affordable housing attached to a development. Every once in a while, there are very explicit comments that it's going to bring in the wrong type of people and how deeply rooted that is into this concept of public housing, right? Like in ShelterWF, we often break out the differences in affordable housing and public housing and all that stuff. But like the general public, they don't really know the difference between all these things. And so just the common concept of public housing is like the IGO towers, or like, you know, people have a certain idea of what affordable housing means.
Yeah, they mentioned the Robert Taylor homes in this, which is where Kendrick Lamar's father lived, and he mentioned that's in some of his songs.
Yeah.
So I thought that connection was particularly interesting to me as well. And
I don't know, do you talk about gentrification and zoning and the ways that these concepts blend? Examples in Whitefish. Did you touch on that at all?
This book doesn't get really
into
into gentrification at all. I think the conversation around gentrification is super fraught. I'll give my brief, 1 minute take on gentrification. Yeah. There is a story of gentrification where it's like there could be a chapter in this book towards the end where it's describing the history of segregation, and then it talks about gentrification.
Yeah.
And it's a continuation of a narrative of Black people are forced into urban ghettos, right, are not allowed to leave, develop culture there as they do.
Yeah.
And you can tell a story about Black America that is basically the triumph of their culture and power over it, and the way that hip hop emerges from these incredibly impoverished places, from the concrete grew a rose type of thing. And then gentrification comes in and even takes those places away from them. Right. I think that story is super valuable and worth including. Yeah. What I don't like is how gentrification as a concept is downstream of a zero-sum mindset in housing, where what we've done is we've said supply is fixed And so because of that, if a place becomes desirable, it will inherently be gentrified and drive out low-income residents. And so the only way a place can remain parochial for the people who have lived there is if it remains really, really shitty. Yeah. And that's what we see in Whitefish. And I talked about this in episode 1, where it's like somebody wants to remodel a house in one of the neighborhoods. Like, that sucks that they're remodeling it because that means someone richer is going to move there. Yeah, and it's like, okay, so everything has to be falling down to be affordable.
Right.
That is entirely a problem that we created ourselves by setting up a zero-sum winners and losers housing system.
Policy focus.
Because we have this super brittle system of zoning that can't respond to demand in any sort of meaningful way.
Yeah. Yep.
That only applies to this economic asset and would be insane if you apply it to literally anything else, right? So that means that learned the term gentrification, and then they say, oh, we can't build a new apartment building here because we're going to gentrify the neighborhood. Yeah. And it's like we've completely reversed the cause and effect here.
Exclusionary zoning reinforces that economic and racial segregation, because places like Whitefish have these exclusionary zoning laws on the book and make it really hard to create housing that middle class and low income people can afford. And so it pushes it on the neighborhoods that already have concentrated poverty. So in the Flathead Valley, right, I think about Evergreen, and that area of town has long been a place where there's been concentrated poverty. But as the housing crisis has escalated and demand has increased, it's pushed more impoverished folks into an area that's already impoverished.
The form of history that is most commonly told about racism, and actually this book points it out where it like quotes some of the big history textbooks that are common. And it's basically like, oh, black families faced de facto racism, where like even if there weren't laws on the books, there was other stuff that happened. And the way that minimizes the series of decisions throughout the United States to perpetuate this system, the amount of suffering that could have been avoided in the past and in the present is almost too much to comprehend. And there's portions, like, this book took me quite a while to get through because there's portions of it where it's like, I need to put it down. And I think it's extremely depressing.
Yeah. And I think these topics can often feel overwhelming and disempowering to talk about. And I think that that's why policy reform is so interesting to me, because it can be a place where you can empower people, right? If you craft the right kind of policy, you can have an impact on our generation now and future generations down the line, right? And so that, to me, that's why I personally decided to get into this work, is that I wanted to be a part of changing policy so that we can start to undo the harms of the past.
Public Comment is a project of ShelterWF. Find out more at shelterwf.org.